When he looked at me across the room and said, "You took everything from me," I felt the air leave my chest, as if someone had reached in and pressed my ribs flat. My name is Margaret. I am 74 years old, and for 8 years I paid bills, fixed cars, and covered rent for the son who now called me a thief. What looked like devotion turned out to be a ledger where my name meant balance rather than love. What happened next would force me into a courtroom, into appointments with doctors who asked uncomfortable questions, and finally into a decision that would save my dignity at a cost I had to weigh with trembling hands. If you have an older parent or an adult child who depends on you, listen closely to this story until the end. How do you prove you were used when everyone says you were only being kind and generous? And how do you choose between the money and your peace of mind? The phone call came at noon on a rainy Thursday. The first line of the conversation was calm, the kind of small talk that hides a line being crossed. Michael said, "Mom, we need to talk," and I thought it would be a question about the car or the furnace. Instead, he said, "Bank called. Your transfer stopped. Can you fix it?" I asked, "Fix what?" He replied, "The transfers to my account." I laughed at first because in my head it was always the same. A quick transfer, a promise to pay back, a sigh of thanks, a reminder to buy groceries. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table, the radio turned low, and I opened the bank book that had been tucked into the drawer like a secret. The numbers did not need translation. In 3 years, there were 64 deposits to his account, including payments described as rent, repairs, loan repayment, car parts, and emergencies. The total added up to $42,352.14. The paper felt heavy in my hands because it was heavier than the conversations that preceded it. Money, pension, transfer, deposit, inheritance, lawyer, these words began to form a map of something that had been happening slowly until it became a road I could not walk back. I will tell you in detail why I decided to stop. I will name the people who saw me as a bank rather than a mother, and the ones who stood with me when I fell. I will show how I documented every withdrawal, how I walked into a bank that smelled of brewed coffee and toner and asked a manager to print every transaction. I will describe the first confrontation at the table with my son and his wife Sarah, and the way their faces hardened as if an accusation of theft were a tired familiarity. There will be a period where social services arrived and a lawyer wrote letters suggesting I might be incapable of making decisions. There will be a hearing where strangers in robes and suits listened to my voice and to the voice of a man who had every reason to hate me, and yet, astonishingly, gave me the chance to explain. Before we get there, I need to go back and tell you who I was and how I arrived at the point where my bank account became a family ledger. I am Margaret Ellen Reed. I grew up in a house with a sagging porch, and a mother who taught me how to sew, and a father who taught me how to fix a lawnmower. My childhood was the kind of scarcity that made you inventive. We learned to stitch torn shirts, to save jars, to make soup from a single chicken bone. I earned a scholarship to a state college, studied bookkeeping for stability more than passion, and spent 32 years as a small business bookkeeper for a bakery that smelled of cinnamon and warm bread. When I retired, my pension was modest but steady. I married young, later divorced without much drama, and devoted my energy to the 2 children I raised. Michael was the older, a restless boy who loved engines and loud music. He was also the child who left the house earlier than his sister, drawn to cities, jobs that paid quick cash, and the promise of more than the town could offer. For much of my adult life, I measured love in practical terms: tuition, rent, a car repair, a guarantee that someone had what they needed. At 65, I found myself with a tidy but small pension and a habit of checking on people who said they were fine when they were not. The habit of helping felt natural. I did not like to see people go without. I thought money could repair the rough parts of life. I thought it was what mothers were for. Michael grew up smart and impulsive. He could build an engine and tear it down again to see what made it behave. As a young man, he worked in construction and later took courses in welding. He loved the heat of a shop and the smell of new metal. Somewhere in his 30s, a relationship with a woman named Sarah became serious. She had charm, quick speech, and an ability to make bills sound manageable. At first, I liked her with the cautious warmth of a mother trying to welcome a new member to the family. Over time, I noticed patterns: lunches where my pension card paid for dinner, repairs for their old truck that I covered, and promises of repayment that never arrived. At a certain point, Michael had trouble holding a steady job, and Sarah became the one who handled conversations about money, calls that began with apologies and ended with details of what needed fixing. I watched him soften, not out of gratitude, but out of dependency. When I later learned she had doctored a medical letter and coaxed a neighbor into giving a false testimony to an assessor, I was not surprised. Their choices were a product of desperation and a certain moral flexibility. That backstory is important because it explains both the motive and the method of the people who wanted to be kept afloat at my expense. The first scene of confrontation had 8 long exchanges around my dining table while rain pattered against the window glass. I remember the smell of coffee and the way the old wood of the table felt cool under my palms. They arrived briskly. Michael sat opposite me, face flushed, Sarah behind him, folding her hands like a woman about to deliver a verdict. I said, "Why are you here?" He said, "We need the transfers." I said, "I have been sending money for 3 years, you know that." He said, "Things are tight." I said, "How much do you need now?" He said, "3,000 this month." I said, "Where did the others go?" He said, "Rent, bills, stuff." I said, "Show me receipts." He said, "We do not have them now." I said, "Then I cannot keep doing this without proof." He said, "You cannot leave us." I said, "I am not leaving anyone. I am asking for proof." Their voices had a practiced desperation. The tactile details stayed with me. Sarah's perfume had a bright citrus note that masked the tension of the room. The light in the room was low, and the radio in the next room hummed. My hands smelled faintly of dish soap from doing the dishes earlier. Each sentence they offered acted like a small incision into the truth. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as a mother, but as an account to be balanced. I made a list because lists had saved me before. On that paper, I wrote every kind of expense I had covered for them in the previous 3 years. Rent to their apartment, 62 payments at $500 a month, 2 deposits a year at a higher amount for summers, totaling $28,500. Car repairs, including 2 alternators, a brake job, tires, and 1 costly transmission repair, total $9,275. Emergency cash withdrawals used for utilities and phones total $2,815. Furniture purchased for their apartment, 1 living room set and 2 mattresses, total $4,125. Cash gifts for birthdays and holidays, $820. 1 loan to help with a medical bill later repaid to my account, $3,412. The total added to $42,352.14. I remember the precise cents because I had printed bank statements with each line item circled. The numbers were not dramatic in isolation, but together they became the truth, a quiet and accumulative theft by proximity. The inventory was evidence, and it was also a map of my misplaced trust. That is when I decided to stop. At the bank, the conversation was procedural and human at once. Lewis, the branch manager, met me in a small office that smelled of paper and lemon cleaner. I sat with the pile of statements and a shaking pen. I said, I want copies of every transfer made to account ending in 718. He said, we can do that. I said, will you flag any transfers that look like they come from me? He said, we will mark them. I said, can we set up alerts? He said, yes, we can set email and phone alerts for any outgoing movement. I said, will you freeze transfers if there is suspicious activity? He said, we can place a temporary hold on transfers until we verify authorization. I said, I do not want an argument. I want a record. He said, then we will build a paper trail. I said, and if they accuse me of being unable to manage my affairs? He paused and said, there are protocols for that. I wrote down his words like a prayer. The bank printed the statements, each transfer in neat columns, descriptive lines that read rent, repair, loan, emergency. I felt a strange currency of shame and relief when the paper stack finished. Lewis walked me through the process of revoking any power of attorney I had inadvertently signed, changing online passwords, contacting fraud, and setting daily limits on my debit card. The office was quiet, except for the printer and the low tap of rain. My fingers traced the numbers as if they were braille of a life changed by arithmetic. When I stopped the transfers, I was not surprised by the reaction. The conversation at the dining table, the one recorded in my memory, now replayed with a higher pitch. Michael called the next morning, and the exchanges were longer and more numerous. He said, Mom, this is wrong. I said, I need receipts. He said, you cannot do this to us. I said, I did this for years without these conversations. He said, your money is ours as family. I said, then show me the family receipts. He called again in the evening, and this time brought Sarah and a lawyer named Elena, who arrived with an envelope and an expression like she had practiced it in the mirror. The dialogue that followed in the living room had 10 sharp exchanges and a soundscape of clinking cups and a clock that ticked like an accusation. Elena said, we are here to help mediate. I said, I need proof. She said, your son is under stress. I said, I understand stress, but I also understand my statements. She said, we may have to petition for guardianship if Margaret is unable to make said decisions. I said, petition for what? She said, for a temporary guardianship so that someone can manage these finances until everything is clarified. I said, who would that someone be? Elena said, perhaps a neutral trustee or a family member. I said, I will not be removed from my account without a hearing. She said, that will be decided in court. I said, then let us prepare for court. The word guardianship felt like a guillotine leaning over a head. The room smelled of the spicy tea Sarah had made. I remember the feel of the sofa fabric under my fingertips and the way the light sluiced through the curtains. Each exchange sharpened the stakes. Their tactic was old and efficient. If you call into question the mind that makes decisions, you can take the decisions themselves. That is legal theater. It is also a common line in cases of financial abuse among the elderly. I called my friend Rosa, who had known me for 45 years and had the blunt kindness of someone who loved you enough to tell you the truth. She came the following morning with a thermos of tea, a notebook, and a steady voice. We sat in the kitchen and went through every receipt I had saved, and many I had not. Rosa said, you have to document everything. I said, I have most of it. She said, we will make copies, make a timeline, and bring witnesses. I said, who will testify? She said, Carmen from next door will say she saw them come by for money. Lewis from the bank will explain the transfers. Thomas, the locksmith, will testify that he changed locks at my request. Christine from the post office will show letters forwarded to their address. Rosa herself would go to the social center and ask for a volunteer witness who had accompanied me to appointments. I began to see the outlines of a defense that was not just spite, but documentation. The house creaked with small, everyday sounds. The kettle on the stove hissed, and the smell of bread toasted in the morning was a small mercy. These sensory details grounded me when the legal words threatened to lift me out of my day-to-day life. Shortly after I cut the transfers, there was a visit that escalated the situation. An assistant from Adult Protective Services named Officer Bennett arrived with a clipboard and a soft tone that suggested authority without aggression. The room where we spoke carried the faint antiseptic scent of a clinic and a thin window that looked onto our maple tree. He asked questions about my daily routine and my sleep and my memory. He asked, "Do you forget to take your pills?" I said, "Never." He asked, "Do you handle bills?" I said, "Always." He asked, "Who controls your money?" I said, "I do." He wrote on his pad and looked at me as if he were mapping my life. The conversation had 3 senses entangled: the smell of the room, the sound of his pen on paper, the sight of his careful face. He said, "Sometimes families worry and file reports to us." I said, "They filed one." He said, "We will do a welfare check and recommend an independent medical evaluation if needed." I said, "I will cooperate." The day after his visit, a nurse phoned to schedule a geriatric assessment. The procedural side of this world was methodical. A clinical psychologist would observe, a social worker would gather home information, and all of it could be used to recommend guardianship if the tests suggested impaired capacity. The idea terrifies many older adults because it replaces one kind of vulnerability with another, being treated as if you are incapable of caring for yourself. The legal preparations required an attorney, and for me, that person was Elena the lawyer, who initially arrived with Sarah, but later became an adversary of sorts when she met my own counsel. At the first consultation, Elena smiled, but my lawyer Elena did not attend that meeting. My lawyer was named Anthony Morales, a quiet man with a firm jaw and a notebook he filled with his own shorthand. He said, "We will request all bank statements, compile affidavits, and ask for an independent competency evaluation by a psychiatrist who works for the court." I said, "How long will this take?" He said, "Weeks to months." I said, "Will I lose my money in the meantime?" He said, "We can ask the judge to impose an interim order that prevents any transfer of funds from your account to their benefit until the court rules." I said, "What does that look like?" He said, "A temporary freeze and an order for your bank to report any attempted transfers." His explanation was blunt and practical and filled with the vocabulary I needed to understand the process: petition, affidavit, temporary restraining order, hearing, competency, appraisal. I felt comfort in those words because they were precise like tools. Anthony explained how witness statements from neighbors and the locksmith Tomas could counter the narrative that I was confused. He asked for the receipts and the printed bank statements and promised to subpoena the bank if necessary. The legal process was slow but precise. It asked for patience and documentation in equal measure. There were scenes of escalating confrontation that I can break into 3 moments of concentrated tension. The first occurred when my son arrived with a forged document that claimed I had signed a power of attorney transferring control of my accounts to him last year. The envelope was thick with paper and a signature that looked like mine. I felt a cold spike in my stomach when Anthony said, "We will send this to a handwriting expert." For minutes, the room contracted into the small circle of the dining table and the hum of the refrigerator. I saw in my mind the long nights I had spent balancing ledgers and comparing numbers, and I thought, how patient they must have been to prepare such a lie. The second moment happened in the courtroom when the judge asked me if I felt coerced into giving the money, and I had to explain a lifetime of habit and the small erosions that add up to exploitation. My throat tightened, and I remembered my mother teaching me to swallow a complaint so it would not make a hole in someone else. The third moment came several weeks later when a young psychiatrist named Dr. Patel arrived with a portable tablet and a kindly face and asked me about my recollection of recent events. I was nervous that a recorded observation would be used to paint me as unreliable. I told him the truth about my days, the names of the people who called, the sums, the smell of the household, the pattern of promises. He leaned forward and said, "The cognitive tests show you are capable of understanding financial decisions." That short phrase changed the direction of the case. The courtroom day itself is the scene I will never forget. and it had 8 long exchanges between me, my son, and the people who stood as witnesses. The room smelled of old wood, the papers were crisp, and the light from the high windows cut across the rows of chairs. Judge Morales entered with a slow dignity and sat. Elena, the attorney for my son, spoke first in a steady voice and described my supposed inability to manage money. Anthony answered with timelines and receipts and printed statements marked with little red circles. Carmen, from next door, gave a witness account about seeing Michael visit for money. Luis, the bank manager, explained the transfers and offered a technical account of authorization processes. Tomas, the locksmith, described the day he changed my locks after I asked him to, and how Michael demanded a key back. Dr. Patel summarized the cognitive evaluation and explained the test results in plain language. At one point, Michael rose and said, "She took from me." He spoke with a pain that sounded real. I stood and said, "I took care of you because I loved you, and I will not stand accused of being incapable." The exchange was raw and included moments of regret and anger from both sides. The judge listened and then, after reviewing the paper trail and hearing the psychiatric report, made a ruling. The court found no basis for immediate guardianship and set conditions that protected my accounts while the civil claim for repayment could proceed. The ruling gave me interim security and the right to manage my own finances. The decision felt like air returning to a room that had been vacuum sealed. The technical part of the process deserves a brief and precise explanation because many of you watching this may face the same bureaucratic maze. To protect an elder from financial abuse, you can request a bank to place a hold on outgoing transfers while you file a petition in civil court asking for a temporary restraining order. The court often orders an independent competency evaluation by a forensic psychiatrist. If there is a dispute over signatures, a handwriting expert can be retained. Powers of attorney can be revoked by filing a revocation document with the bank and the court. Adult Protective Services can open an inquiry that documents alleged exploitation and may recommend social services interventions. These are not guarantees, but they are the practical steps that form a record and create legal protections. Despite the judge's interim victory, the aftermath was not neat. The family fractured in ways that felt both clinical and intimate. Michael stopped calling with the same frequency. His voice at first was blunt and later softened into messages that read like attempts at negotiation. Sarah unfollowed me on social media and removed photos where I had once been in the background smiling. The neighbor Carmen brought over a pie, and more than once, Rosa sat with me to help sort mail. I donated a portion of the recovered funds to a local shelter because I did not want the money to become a poison in my life. That choice surprised even me. Giving away some of the money felt like returning it to a world where compassion did not equal enabling. It was a complicated reconciliation between justice and mercy. Around the point where I had finished totting up the receipts and made the decision to stop, I asked viewers a question, and I still believe it matters to you. If you were in my place, would you cut off the aid immediately or attempt another conversation to set boundaries while continuing to help? Start your answer in the comments with "I would cut" or "I would try," and then tell us why. Your comments help others who may be deciding what to do. The community here is made stronger by your honesty, and your stories could be useful to someone sitting at a kitchen table with a pile of bank statements and a pounding heart right now. After you leave that comment, come back and listen to what happened when I actually stopped the transfers. There were moments of humiliation that I have to admit left a bruise. At a neighbor's birthday party, they whispered that my son had always been irresponsible and that I should have known better. At a church gathering, a woman I had trusted asked me in a low voice, "Are you sure you were not being taken advantage of?" Those were the small stings that accumulate like gravel in a pocket. I remember one Sunday when Clara, my granddaughter, sat on my lap and said, "Grandma, why do they look at you funny?" I could not answer her then. I am glad now that Rosa and Carmen and Louis were there to counter those whispers with facts and presence. Louis took the time to explain to some of our mutual acquaintances how withdrawals are authorized, and how elderly clients can be protected. That community support mattered more than any one court ruling. There were 5 people I want to name properly because they were instrumental in the process. Anthony Morales, my attorney, who taught me how to translate my life into documents. Elena, the opposing counsel, a professional who believed in her client and forced me to raise my own defenses with clarity. Dr. Patel, the psychiatrist, whose calm and measured tests proved my competence. Lewis, the bank manager who printed statements at a moment's notice and walked me through security changes. Thomas, the locksmith, who arrived in the rain and changed locks at dusk with a toolbox scratched and patient. Each of them played a role, and each one had to be coaxed into believing the truth we had built together. There were also others who mattered. Christine at the post office, who produced proof of mail forwarding, Officer Bennett from Adult Protective Services, who performed the welfare check, Judge Morales, who weighed the evidence carefully and issued the interim order, and Rosa and Carmen, who provided the neighborhood witness accounts. That is more than 5 names, but I wanted you to know them because each person represents a link in a chain that eventually protected me. I had 3 concentrated moments of decision where I almost gave up. The first was the day the forged power of attorney arrived, and it looked so authentic that I felt my grasp on reality slip. I remember sitting on the kitchen floor and staring at the signature as if I could see the hand that made it. For an hour, I thought it was all over. The second was when the judge suggested a delay in the hearing because of scheduling conflicts, and my grief thought was that time would work against me. Weeks felt like an enemy. The third was the night Michael came to the house in a raincoat, stood on the porch, and begged me to reconsider. He said, "Mom, please do not make me choose the street over my family." I said, "I am not making you choose the street. I am making you choose truth." We argued until the rain soaked his cuffs, and I felt both pity and resolve. Those moments tested me because they asked whether compassion could be confused with self-erasure. I chose the latter for a time and later found a softer boundary that allowed contact without financial enabling. The hearing itself required detailed preparation. Anthony instructed me to tell the truth and to avoid dramatic flourishes. He said, "Facts are your fortress." He subpoenaed bank records, the locksmith's invoice, and the printed list of transfers I had prepared. He arranged for Carmen to sign an affidavit and for Dr. Patel to be ready to present his evaluation. The courtroom exchanges were careful and methodical and included several extended dialogues between attorneys that felt more like chess than argument. Elena questioned the reliability of my recollection, and Anthony countered with documentation. The judge asked clarifying questions and at one point asked me directly, "Why did you help for so long?" I replied, "You help because you cannot stand to hear someone you love say they are hungry or cold." He nodded and then later asked Dr. Patel about the cognitive tests. The detail in those moments was judicially sober. The verdict did not feel poetic, but it was practical. My autonomy would be respected and interim protections would be in place. After the legal noise quieted, I had to rebuild routine and trust with myself. I changed the locks and set up a simple camera in the entry that records but does not broadcast. Tomas fitted the new lock and showed me how to use it. He smelled of oil and metal and coffee, and he made the mechanics of safety feel intimate. I set up automatic payments for my bills so I would not be tempted to give impulsively. I started going to a community center once a week for a knitting circle where people talked about grandchildren and recipes. The knitting circle became a refuge where I learned to let conversation be small and ordinary again. I also enrolled in a part-time class in watercolor painting because I wanted to feel color outside of receipts. The sound of the paintbrush on paper and the smell of wet pigments were small pleasures that healed something deeper than money. 1 month later, I was living in a house that felt the same yet different. I had a sense of lightness that was strange and sometimes guilty. I still received messages from Michael, but they were shorter. I spent afternoons at the library learning to use a tablet for online banking, and I felt both clumsy and proud. The legal action had produced an interim freeze on transfers, and the bank had reversed several questionable withdrawals pending an investigation. I donated $5,000 to a local shelter because I did not want the recovered funds to act as bait for more complicated resentments. Rosa and Carmen visited weekly, and we made soup and compared notes about neighbors. I had a counseling session where I spoke about the humiliation, and the counselor suggested setting boundaries that were practical rather than punitive, and named 3 ways to say no without cutting people off from love. I started to accept that refusing to enable was itself an act of care. I slept better and my appetite returned. The house smelled of lemon and cleaned wood. I took out a small box of photographs and put a few frames in new places, a symbolic act that felt like reclaiming domestic space. 3 months after the hearing, there was a slow thaw between me and some family members, but not all. Michael left a message that said, "I am sorry for how things went." He did not ask for money. We met at a small diner and had a long conversation with coffee cooling between us. There were 8 exchanges between us that moved from accusation to explanation to apology and then to a tentative plan. He said, "I did not mean to hurt you." I said, "You did not mean to use me as your bank." He said, "I know we messed up." I said, "You can start by finding a steady job." He said, "I am looking." I said, "And stop asking for money." He said, "I will." It was not reconciliation in the sense of everything being fixed, but it was a start. In those 3 months, I traveled to a nearby lake alone and watched the light find the water. I donated an additional $3,000 to an organization that supports elders who are financially abused because I wanted to turn my loss into something meaningful. I also began teaching a small workshop at the community center about recognizing financial exploitation and compiling proof. The workshop was a way of hosting my story as a resource. People came with tearful expressions and careful notes. We compared questions and practiced how to ask for bank statements and how to place alerts. That felt like building armor for others. 6 months later, life had reconfigured into a new pattern that was steadier and fuller. The bank's investigation concluded with a recommendation for a civil suit that is ongoing, and the judge declined to assign guardianship. Michael and I spoke less often but more honestly. I had taken a short trip to a coastal town with Rosa, and we walked on sand that felt like cool sugar underfoot. I paused in a small art gallery and bought a painting by a local artist with some of the funds I had earmarked for recovery. I gave a talk at a local senior center about boundaries and the difference between helping and enabling, and how to keep records. People asked for concrete forms and templates, and I offered copies of the inventory I created. I felt a new clarity about how I wanted my later years to look. I started volunteering at an advocacy group that connects elders with legal aid volunteers. The work was modest but meaningful. The most surprising thing was not that I had money in my account or a legal decision in my favor, but that I had regained a sense of authorship over my life. Where I had once measured my worth in transfers and small rescues, I now measured it in mornings that began with coffee and a feeling of quiet. There are practical lessons here for anyone who believes they might be in a similar situation. Keep paper records and print online statements. Ask for written justifications for transfers described as loans. Use bank alerts to track activity. If someone threatens to petition for guardianship, gather witnesses who can speak to your daily competencies. Seek legal counsel early and ask the bank to place a temporary hold on transfers when there is evidence of exploitation. Contact Adult Protective Services if you suspect abuse. These steps create a protective documentary trail that courts and agencies respect. It is messy, it is bureaucratic, but it works. I have been asked often how I felt when my son, the boy I raised and paid for in quiet ways, said he had every reason to hate me. In the moment, it was a hollowing pain that felt like betrayal. Later, it became an opportunity to explain, to say the things you do in a voice that is softer but not weaker. He had every reason to be angry about the loss of money and the shame that comes with admitted dependence. He had less reason to believe the narrative that I was incompetent. The chance to explain altered the tone of our relationship, even if it did not salvage everything. There is a dignity in asking for accountability and a dignity in offering help that comes with limits. The court did not give me back the years I had spent covering for others. That recovery was mine to do. It cost me relationships, time, and an emotional price that cannot be counted on a ledger. It also gave me back a life that was mine, decision by decision. If this story touched you, please leave a comment starting with "I would cut" or "I would try," and tell us what you think should be the first step when an older parent suspects exploitation. Your comment can help someone who is unsure what to do. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more real stories about elders who stand up for themselves and about practical steps to protect financial independence. There are people and services ready to help and a community of neighbors who can step in if you ask them to. In the end, I learned that love and money are different languages. Love without boundaries can become harm, and money without explanation becomes a map of trust that can be exploited. My greatest victory was not the number on a bank statement, but the return of my right to decide how to live my days. I chose to keep my dignity and to teach others how to do the same. If you are watching this and sitting with a bank statement and a question, start by making a list and finding a friend who will help you document. Take a breath, print your records, and speak your truth, because the chance to explain may be the moment that saves your life.